Okay, here we are, world's greatest dads and moms and friends of world's greatest dads and people aspiring to be world's greatest dads. Listen, I think you're already a world's greatest dad, but if you need you want a little bit of, it's always good to have room for improvement. And so we will say, you'll get there. You'll get there. You're on your way. Welcome to another of our big questions episodes. This is World's Greatest Dad, Big Questions, how to talk to kids about war and violence.
This one is, I guess, sadly timely, and I think this is going to be really interesting because, like, the God thing, which was a recent Big Questions episode, that's kind of like, I don't know, felt a little more easy, obscure, if you will. Like, the war thing is, I just feel like on everyone's minds right now, and it's something that I've like talked about a bit. It's crazy. This is gonna be a big one. This is a big one. Here we go.
Okay, I don't even know where to start, but we have to start somewhere. Yeah, war is kind of, well, first let me say it depends where you're living. I am in New York City. You are in Austin, Texas.
Hmm.
We and this will come up throughout the episode. We've been insulated from war for many decades as Americans who, you know, maybe haven't had anyone in the military in our family in generations. The last person to serve in the military in my family was my grandfather in World War II. They named themselves the greatest generation, which, I think they
Hmm.
were a little bit biased, but that's okay. I didn't fight against the Nazis. He did. He was in the Battle of the Bulge, survived it. Must not have been the first wave, right? Maybe he was. I don't know. Anyways, war is, what is it good for? Absolutely nothing, except it is the topic of today's episode. You know, to Ollie's point, depending on where you are in the world, war is probably always happening. It's just about how close to home it is. And because we are so interconnected with the internet and TV and social media, we get to see, and our kids get to see images of war all the time, especially if you are avid TV watchers like my wife and we often have the news on, and that's a choice we make because we want to be informed I think we don't want to compartmentalize our news intake and events happen in real time. But as a result, our daughter can read, our son's learning to read, and they see these images and they have big questions. Their big questions are, is everyone okay? What's happening? Is that blood? I mean, like really specific, gory stuff. We also live in a time, because we're not just going to talk about war abroad, we're going to talk about violence in general and how to talk to kids about violence. I was in middle school when the Columbine shooting happened, which was not the first school shooting, but perhaps it was a turning point in our country where they became more and more and more and more common to the point where it seems sometimes like our country or there are leaders of the country go, yeah, that's, school shootings happen. Shootings happen and it is what it is. As if they're just, I don't know, Tony Soprano talking
Helplessly
Carmella.
tied with hands behind their back by a powerful lobby that ultimately is there just to
Yeah. Well, and that'll
sell
be
things.
for our politics episode. We're talking about how to talk to kids about, that'll be how to talk about super PACs, how to talk to kids about war and violence. So, we say all this to set up that it's not fun. Most of these questions aren't, but they are essential and they're real. And, my kids do active shooter drills in their school. I don't know if your son does them at his. And you know, they sometimes, not always, but they should, but they send home hey, by the way, if you want to talk to your kids, we had this active shooter drill today, and we're like, well, what do we do with that? And it's really scary because you want to protect your kids at all costs, right? Above all else. And this is one of those things where you think, well, gosh, I feel so powerless, because usually these are the types of things that are truly out of our control. Unlike religion, which ironically is more in our control because you decide how you treat someone else and you can decide
Hmm.
what you believe or don't believe and how you respect or don't respect someone. This is one where what do you do? I mean, these acts are so senseless. So I'm curious, has this come up in your home? What has Heath asked, if anything, and have you broached any kind of like, whether it's school shootings or mass shootings or just, kind of war, violence in general? How has this come up with you and your son?
War as a topic has been coming up lately, and that's going to be a deeper dive on my end. So I kind of wanted to touch on the school shooting thing, because Brearley worked at the school. She actually described the drills they do for an active shooter, which are pretty wild. And given the fact that, Texas is a state that's known to, be pretty free with the weapons. I don't know, that kind of hits extra hard a little bit, I guess. But, Heath's never really asked me. We've never really talked about school shootings and things like that, which is interesting. It's never been brought up. And I'd also add, too, I'm not saying there's a one-to-one here, but it is funny. Like, he plays a lot of, like, shooter games, So it's weird how we all, to some degrees, are quite numb to violence in different ways, right? Whether it's movies, TV, video games, whatever. And so I don't know. There hasn't, Uvalde happened, and that wasn't something that I think hit home to him. Even though it was a horrific, I want to say, pretty large scale shooting in the state in Texas. But that kind of wraps that up there. But I will say, probably a moment where it really hit that I am now a parent and I look at things differently. You had brought up Columbine happened when you were in middle school. Columbine happened like almost right when I graduated college. And I remember I was like, well, this is crazy. That's wild. When Sandy Hook happened, Heath was maybe around 1. And I remember that time of year, I was invited to go to a former employer's Christmas party. And I didn't. I went straight home. And I just, like, that news hit me so hard. Ever since then, I mean, not that I jump up and down and beat this drum on social media, but I have really believed that there is something not enough is being done with making this not happen. And yes, I do believe in massive amounts of gun control. I'd rather frankly live in England. That's my choice. You know what I mean? In terms of like guns on the street or whatever. And that's going to be a whole other thing too, because that turns into policy and the Second Amendment and all that kind of mumbo jumbo. But the bottom line is I don't want to live in a world where that should be so remote from happening. Like,
Hmm.
unless I was in a war zone. But yeah, the school shooting thing was a huge moment of reckoning where I was like, I'm a parent and I look at these things with a very, very, very specific POV on it.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, and it's interesting because ever since Columbine, you mentioned video games. It was, I believe, violent video games and Marilyn Manson were kind of the boogeyman for the root causes of why the Columbine shooting massacre happened. And they continue to be kind of like these lightning rod scapegoats, I think, and I think the reality is, like you say, it's a lot more complicated than that. Correlation does not equal causation. I did just want to mention, since we're talking about it, and, there's a lot of debate about whether or not violent movies make kids more violent or playing violent video games make kids more violent. The research, most studies have found that violent media doesn't directly make kids more violent.
Mm-hmm.
But repeated exposure to images of violence can desensitize kids to aggression or, make aggressive responses seem normal. And I think, so what do we do with that, right? Because I think there is a big difference between an image of violence in media and committing an act of violence in real life. But I think it's about how do we and do we even talk about the images you're seeing. And I think that goes for any media. We talk about screen time when kids are really little, but how often do we talk about it when they're teens or even in their 20s when you're watching, especially, and we'll get to this in a different big question episode, but let's say, you're watching some really violent sexual images, and there's no conversation around it. How are you supposed to know what's acceptable, what's not, what is play, what is real? Some tips for parents and educators, and these will probably be no surprise, but I'll say them anyway because they may help someone. monitor age appropriate content. There's a great website, Common Sense Media
Mm.
organization, that often recommends, in addition to just reviewing the substance of the content, will say, like, hey, this age group is probably best suited for this kind of movie or TV show or video game. So you definitely want to make sure that your kid is exposed to what is considered age appropriate content. Make sure that you watch it with them. Doesn't mean you have to watch every day or play video games with them all the time, but you should know what they're playing. You shouldn't. You don't have to be like, oh, I've never heard of that. I didn't even know that they were exposed to that. Figure out what media they're consuming. Get a handle on it. Speak the language. Emphasize empathy and real life consequences of violence, right? It's one thing to hurt someone, kill someone in a video game, when it's literally part of the game, when you score points or they're an obstacle to whatever, achievement you want to achieve in Grand Theft Auto 15. It's very different to do that in real life. And I think most people, you hope, know that. But what's the worst thing that can happen? Just talk about it. Talk about it with your kids. And then you want to balance pro-social games, stories, and activities that promote cooperation and understanding, which is very interesting. And we should do a big questions episode about games and winning, because it comes to this idea of, like, is everything conflict driven, or are there things we can achieve together without violence? What are the alternatives to violence? And so I think that's another big piece about how you talk to kids about violence, is not just in kind of an apathetic, yeah, it's bad and stinks and hopefully it doesn't happen, but what are the other options? Violence doesn't have to be the only solution.
I it's funny, like, to me the big issue, or maybe what I need to maybe look at again, and it's hard because you hear about this horrible stuff, and it's not fun to like dive into this stuff. It's horrific. It's sad. It's the most painful thing we could probably agree on across the board, is a parent losing their child, certainly in a violent manner like that. But like, there is something about how, and this is just what's the fatigue of the news cycle right now, but how it's like, yeah, that was bad, and then we move on. And, maybe the whole thing with, I feel like that causation absolutely makes sense, but the numbness to it all, and I do feel just generally, even just in approaching this topic, numb, like sadly numb as a parent, because it's so painful. Like one shooting like a Columbine or Uvalde should stay with us forever. But the thing is then, we move on to another one, and then it's sad that we have to even rate it on a scale of like, well, how bad was it? And I wonder if that kind of numbness is, with Heath, and his years, his peer group or whatever too, because they're like, oh yeah, that's bad, that's sad, but I'm fine, I guess. Like, it's, when you think about it, I feel like as a parent, and we're talking about violence, you're almost like, you just want to like literally hit the brakes on everything, going, what the hell are we doing right now? Like, cancel the football games. You know what I mean? Like, stop everything, shut it down, and fix it right now. I mean, that's when I start to really think about it, the more I'm just like, how are we in this constant state? And that to me is, it's frustrating, actually. It's
Yeah. I
frustrating.
mean, there was that shooting at the NFL offices in New York City,
Yeah.
and the result was beefed up security at those particular offices. I think that part of it also comes from, and this is a theme we touch on a lot, just empathy and connection. And I think, I might be butchering this, but the Mel Brooks line of tragedy is when I cut my finger, comedy is when you fall into a sewer and die, is kind of a cousin of the old comedy aphorism of comedy is tragedy plus time. And I think it's not just time, it's distance, right? And I think the more distant we are from an event, the less we feel it. I've never been a victim or kind of in the mix of a violent episode that involved guns
Hmm.
or even knives. Sure, probably, some bar fights, some kind of scary situations with people, but never with a weapon. And I'm fortunate. I know that that is not the norm, especially in America.
Hmm.
But it's interesting, and words matter, definitions matter. But we posted a clip from an episode with Michael Lombardo, one of our world's greatest dads, who is a bird watcher and a leader in Brooklyn, leading the McGolrick bird watching community, and he told a story about surviving a shooting at the Google offices. And we said, we kind of captioned it with surviving a mass shooting, you know, really changed my life. And I think it was part of his story and his journey to kind of like, of on this trajectory towards finding what he really enjoys and his fulfillment. And a lot of the comments were, that's not a mass shooting. Nobody died, or not enough, like that. The takeaway was that it didn't qualify as quite extreme enough. And I understand, the logic of having to qualify something. I think that they maybe shot four or five people. People sustained pretty serious injuries, but I think like the bar being, oh, it has to be at a school, and it has to be a dozen people, or it has to be at a concert, and it has to be,
Hmm.
or a movie theater, dozens of people. Otherwise, it doesn't count. And then I think about if I were Michael or Michael's family member, friend, and I'm hearing the shots and knowing there is an active shooter and the way I feel, does it really matter, you know, that it's like, well, technically it doesn't qualify as it's like
Yeah.
this idea of we are so disconnected from other people's tragedies that we don't see them as our own is I think part of what allows these incidents to keep happening over and over and over. It's something I talk about with our schools. This is a separate thing, but kind of related. Like, our kids go to public school in Brooklyn, and I very much feel like there is a dialogue of, oh, well, that's a good school. Well, there are they at a good school? And I think that's kind of the way we
Hmm.
talk about it. And what we mean is, are your kids taken care of? Forget everybody else. Not acknowledging that, like, this is a much broader system, and that I almost wish that we could assume that all the schools in the city, in our district even, were good schools. Not that they all need to be exactly alike, but there is kind of this zero sum game. And anyway, I say all this because I think to bring it back to war and violence, I think a lot of the conflict comes from a lack of empathy, a lack of cooperation. And I would lean into talking to your kids about those things. About, I think it's become a little bit Pollyanna to use that old Mr. Rogers quote, look for the helpers. I'm sure like you've
Hmm.
seen that like the last few
Yeah.
years where every tragedy happens and it's very beautiful. But I think it's one of those things where it becomes so almost like feels like toxic positivity because you're like, yeah, that's great. Look for the helpers, look for the firefighters and the police officers who are helping and just the neighbors who volunteer and good Samaritans. But at the same time, you're like, yeah, but how do we stop this violence thing?
Yeah.
That's instead of having to just clean up after the mess, how do we prevent the mess in the first place? So, I'm curious your thoughts on all that.
I mean, it's hard not to get into this without asking, like, I think some core questions. And at least we can look at it as where we live in America, right? And this is something that's really been on my mind lately as I kind of approach beyond midlife, going, what is the end game here? How does this all work out? And I think it's amazing that for the country that has built the quote greatest economy in the world, that's also increased that number substantially in the last 20 years. We have such fundamental issues that have no resolution in play in sight. One, to be specific, is gun violence in schools. We can just I think everyone can agree that there should be no gun violence in schools. People can say, oh, well, our guns a problem, but there should not be gun violence in schools in general. And also, there are other bigger things too, like how is it, we have like the disparity of wealth and, healthcare and education. So you brought this up because you brought up school. And what's interesting is I feel like throughout my time as an adult, kind of observing things like I remember when, case in point, Katrina happened, right? Horrible hurricane hits New Orleans. I was living in Los Angeles at the time, and a person who I talked to, and this is someone who was more of the conservative mindset. I remember he brought it up. He looked at this tragedy and he said, well, I mean, look at that city. It's like in a floodplain. And I'm like, this is the United States of America. We were currently engaged in a huge war in Iraq for weapons of mass destruction. And yet, all of a sudden, something happens here, and it's like, well, that's what you get for living there. I mean, that kind of mentality of going, you know what? they were at the wrong place at the wrong time, or you know what, that's a bad neighborhood, or you know what, they don't want to put in the resources for their school. Like, I feel like we just have this thing of like, it's so easy to abandon each other. You know, like it's so difficult, and especially now in this era that's massively divisive. But this has been an ongoing problem where it's like, even, and you know what, I'll put some of the blame on my shoulders. We chose to leave Los Angeles, where we lived for a very, very long time, to move to Austin, and a lot of reasons. But one of them, the main reason I always talk about, he goes, oh, well, he's got to go to a great school. And it's like, you just kind of go, oh, you know what? I'm leaving this area despite what I initially drew me to it because I'll go chase something better somewhere else. And that was my own version of kind of surrendering, giving up, going, there's nothing I can do here. I'm just going to go over here now. And then choose the path of privatization. So, sure, to me, a lot of it is like, when do we just kind of go, you know what, we got to roll up the sleeves and go, we got to figure this out here. Like, this is, when do you make that line in the sand and go, this cannot keep going? There's got
Yeah.
to be
Well,
some.
and the answer, so far has been, mostly okay, let's try not to get killed. Try not to get our kids killed and rather than address the systemic kind of reasons that this is happening. And that's, obviously the elephant in the room is guns. But there's also, mental health services and therapy and, just all of the programs that could help people, who are at risk of either committing or being victims of violent acts. And so, anyway, we've got this list of questions that children might ask, typically ask about war, about violence, and we want to kind of run through them so that we can kind of offer responses that you can feel free to use, not use, modify, but so that you have some kind of script. Because I think, like always, and this is why we're doing this series, is these big questions, these issues come up, and we realize we think, oh, we're pretty good dads. And we go to Dave and Buster's, and we take them to the movies, and we make grilled cheese. We're awesome. And then we're like, oh yeah, I don't know how to explain this
Mm,
school shooting. So, anyways, here are some of the questions that kids might ask about violence. Could this happen at our school? Your child might ask, and you can be honest but reassuring at the same time. You can say something like, schools work really hard to keep their students safe.
mm-hmm,
There are rules and there are adults whose job it is to protect everyone. Bad things can happen anywhere. That's true. That's part of life. And it's important to know that schools are doing their best to prevent them. And then you hope that they're doing their best, right? I think that's the truth. That's the reality is what are they doing, besides these drills? I mean, we saw that police in Uvalde didn't necessarily help the situation or save any lives. And that happens sometimes. It is interesting that you can theoretically feel safer at Madison Square Garden than at a public school in anywhere USA because there are metal detectors, right?
mm-hmm,
And I think that also just kind of goes to our nation's priorities. I'm talking about America specifically, that we, value more, we value lives more at a concert that people are spending, upwards of 75 or $100 a ticket, depending on who it is. If it's Beyonce, it's 1,000
mm-hmm,
than just at school every day. I don't know that any conversation with your kids can make that pill easier to swallow, but that's kind of our reality at this moment. When they ask, can it happen here? The answer is yeah, yeah, it can, but your school is doing everything they can to make sure it won't. And then you, as the parent, have to go do that homework and see if that's true. And if it's not true, you better make sure that your school's doing everything they can to make sure that it won't. Your kid might ask, why did someone kill children? Why did someone kill those kids? And again, the advice from the experts is to be direct. You don't have to be graphic. That doesn't mean, talking about the specific, bleeding out or, the specific motives of the killer, but you can just say sometimes people make bad choices. Sometimes people hurt other people, and that is not the fault of anyone who got hurt. Most people do not act this way. Most people do not do this. And again, there are adults who want to keep you safe, who want to keep kids safe, who care about you, who love the kids in your community, in your school, but not everybody, And I think, the way we refer to them with our kids is tricky people, you know? We don't even necessarily call them bad people or evil people, although perhaps you could. We call them tricky. And I think it's because you want your kids to the best of their ability, recognize that most adults have their best interest at heart, but not all. And some of them are tricky, and to try to kind of start recognizing those signs to the best that you can. We are talking about war as well. War can be very violent. Perhaps by definition it is violent. Why do people fight wars? What is war? Your kids might ask.
Mm.
And here's where you can kind of give context, and you don't have to give judgment if you don't want to. You can just say war happens when a country or a group of people can't solve their problems peacefully. Usually people are fighting for things, for power, for resources. Sometimes they're fighting over their beliefs, which kind of ties into our God question episode.
Hmm.
But most people, again, really want to live in peace. And many, many, many people try to stop wars from happening. And that, whatever we can control as individuals to contribute toward peace and to avoid violence, to avoid war, to the best of our ability. One person, is but one raindrop, right? But a drop, drop, drip, 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 you can fill the whole bucket, right? And so I think it's about aligning yourself with other people who feel that peace is important. It's hard, I think about World War II, top of mind, because again, like my grandfather fought in it. It's one of those wars we like to talk about, not like Vietnam or Iraq, because we're like,
Yeah, World War II is like
that
it's
was like the good
an
one.
excuse to keep fighting wars, to be honest. I mean, for in a broad way, it really is. Like, even though I'm someone who's like, well, I don't know. I've seen Saving Private Ryan a bunch of
Sure.
times, so it's
Yeah.
hard for me to not go. They did the right. They saved Matt Damon, but generally, I'd be like, no, war is a failure of institutions, right? It's a failure of institutions. But what's interesting is the way we can frame war between two countries versus an act of violence between groups of people, because that's when we bleed into terrorism, Like, I think terrorism, the terrorists would go, we're fighting a war. That's the other thing too. It's a deeper one. What quote? I think when it's war between countries, it's like you can sit there objectively and go, well, there's two versions of what's considered a just cause. But terrorism, school shooting, that's when you get into, and to a degree rightfully so, people will add to that, it is evil, right? I heard a great way to describe what happened on October 7th as immoral, and I think immoral is a great way to describe terrorism, and to a degree war. I think war is immoral. I mean, to look at what happened at World War II, that should have been. Was that the one where they say? Was it World War One where they say it's the war to end all wars? But we should have just come to the conclusion that this is just going to become a huge, regrettable mess for years and years and years and years and years. And we're all better off when we have prosperity and negotiation, and hence the United Nations. But what's so funny, I don't know. I'm just going down a rabbit hole here, but the
Yeah.
United Nations is essentially powerless because they can't back it up with war. Yeah.
Mm, right. So you mentioned, excuse me, terrorism. I'm in New York City. My daughter is 7. She really likes these I Survived books. This is popular among her age group. I don't know if you're familiar. It's like, I survived a bear attack. I survived a shark attack. I survived
Seriously?
the
This
Chicago
sounds
fire.
traumatizing.
Yeah, I think it's a way to learn science and history through. It's kind of like how you need stakes. You need an exciting hook. And so she's been asking a lot about 9/11
Whoa.
and the Twin Towers. And it's one of those. I mean, look, I think we all. Every generation has their event or events that are defining culturally for them that they quote unquote live through. Um, that one day your kids will ask about. I think I know for my parents it was the JFK assassination, Martin Luther King assassination, I guess man walking on the moon, if you believe that, bull walkie. Well, that's another
I
episode.
wasn't there. I wasn't on the moon, so it's BS.
Have we ever been? So, and then for me, it was certainly, and again, this is where I was in 11th grade when 9/11 happened. And, DC's been asking, who did it? Why'd they do it? How did it
Mm.
happen? Like all of the questions that, just the very specific, you're like reliving it in some ways.
Did you ever watch Fahrenheit 911?
Not yet, not yet. Maybe in third grade.
Fair enough.
But yeah, no. So I think, look, the truth is, life and violence is happening all around us. It has
Hmm.
always happened. It will likely continue to happen. But how are we having these conversations with our kids to both understand it, process it in healthy ways, and hopefully be a part of some peaceful solutions to prevent more of it in the future? So we're not done with the questions that kids might ask. Kids might ask, why do some people have guns? And what about in video games where people shoot each other? And you need to distinguish reality from games if you haven't already. So you can say something like, some people have guns for work, for hunting, for what they believe is their own protection. But guns, if not handled safely, if you are not trained, if you are not, obeying the rules, they can be very, very dangerous. Video games are pretend. They don't work the same way as real life. You don't get 9 lives. You can't just turn it off and turn the console back on again. And it's important that in real life, we don't ever treat anyone the way we treat them in video games.
I think these are all fair agreements. I'm kind of curious though, and not to like take put take a pop the balloon, so to speak. But when she's reading "I survived a shark attack," I mean that's got to be a horrible recovery. You know what I mean? Like, I mean, I've seen the beach. You probably saw
Yeah.
the beach when you were probably high
I
school.
mean, they survived. We actually watched, it was marathon weekend, and we watched a person, they did a whole profile on them on the news who was running the marathon, who lost part of their leg, half of their leg from a shark attack, but now was running the marathon. So, they
Like
survived.
it's so I don't know, pretty grim. I got, it's funny like cuz Heath does play a lot of video games, violent video games. He was just at paintball
Hmm.
a little like 2 weekends ago. He texted me a picture of him with this pretty realistic looking. I mean, this thing looked like a hand cannon. You know what I mean? It was a paintball gun, but I was like, dude, stay on the field. The cops will shoot you. That thing looks insane. Yeah, it's it's funny. This really makes God feel easy because the whole violence thing is nuts. I think really feels as a parent our great plague. I remember a great crisis. Like, for a long time, AIDS was a huge crisis. This is ravaging us. Like, and eventually modern medicine found a way, right? But maybe there's an Ozempic out there that will make people less inclined to get violent. And certainly accessibility is to me the biggest thing. It's, people get into the debate all the time. I'm happy to have it. And I just am going to share my position. Like, yeah, if you didn't have access to a piece of machinery that was designed for war, you wouldn't have this kind of reaction to that kind of accessibility. Period. Point blank. But another thing I think it's so fair because it is this. We're parents. We have kids. It's like we want this to be solved, right? If another part of it is, frankly, the larger investment, or how about any investment into mental health services, I think that is huge too. Because, by the way, as I said, some of the huger problems that I kind of struggle with as an adult in America is like healthcare sucks here. You know what I mean? It's not great. There's not great accessibility. It looks like we're going to get hit with harder premiums. We're on the exchange, aka Obamacare. Mental health is barely covered at all. And yet, these are these real life causes that are creating these situations that are politicized. It's like, oh, it's a mental health thing. Like, great. Well, you want to help out with that? You know what I mean? It's yeah. It literally it just makes my head spin. Like this is what we live with.
So another question that kids might ask about war and violence is, why do some people get hurt because of where they live or because they are a certain race or religion? And here's where the empathy comes in. You can say something like, sometimes people are treated unfairly because of where they live, what they
Hmm.
look like, what they believe, and just point blank, you say this is wrong. And there are people and organizations working to make sure that everyone is treated fairly and safely. And again, this is where you can model that behavior and make sure that your kids see you treating people respectfully and that they know that that's how they should treat other people. And again, this isn't exactly, have a straight line toward, committing violent acts, but I think it's all kind of in the same stew, right? Of like understanding someone else's humanity, respecting them, knowing that there are ways to solve conflict without hurting someone. These are all kind of, I think, pushing us in the right direction towards nonviolence.
I think there's a POV too that's worth exploring as well. Like I had brought up this thing about how, we have this habit of kind of surrendering parts of America, like it's them, it's that color state, or, it's in a bad area. This is something that literally just hit a little while ago. Heath is someone who, listens to a lot of rap music and was watching like YouTube and stuff like that, and something got popped up where he had brought up like Atlanta, the city of Atlanta is a dangerous place. It's like crime ridden. I mean, very broadly speaking here to what he was saying. And I was like, I think I know the kind of content you're probably being exposed to. And sure, there are going to be areas in any major urban place that have crime, but I already saw him in a way kind of just write off a place like, oh yeah, that place is violent. And then it becomes a thing of, do they deserve that? You know what I mean? Do they deserve to be not cared for and to not show empathy for? I think that's something so huge. And you know what? I think that's something, if there's one thing to kind of take away from all this stuff, is that the lack, we should hopefully have the conversation with our kids where we should simply just be more empathetic to places where they happen to live with violent acts or the higher likelihood of violent acts, because I really do believe there's something in here where it's just easy to kind of write off a place or a people that's not in our immediate vicinity. Is like, oh well, I mean, maybe they deserve it, or maybe that's just because that happens to them, when the truth is it could happen to any of us. My soapbox moment.
Well said. So let's go through age by age. What's appropriate to talk to your kids, or what are the appropriate things to say depending on your kid's age when violence comes up or war comes up and questions arise? So ages 3 through 5. Experts advise when war or violence comes up as a topic with children ages 3 through 5, use very simple language. Make sure it's concrete. Say things like, some people use violence to hurt others. That's not okay. We are safe. Reassure them you're safe with us. Again, avoid graphic details. It's not necessary for that age group. And you can use play. You can use stories. You can read books about helping others, about bravery, about kindness. Again, model the behaviors that you want your children to exhibit and learn and aspire to as they grow old, and not the violent ones that we're trying to protect against. Children ages 6 through 9, when violence or war comes up as a topic, here's what you can do. You can introduce concepts of safety to them. You can talk about guns in a very simple way. You say, guns are weapons. They hurt people. Only grown-ups should handle them safely, and not all grown-ups should. But certainly kids should never touch them, have access to them. These are not a thing for kids. You can talk about video games, because chances are ages 6 through 9, they've had some exposure, whether through film or video games or TV shows, to violent imagery. You see kids with water guns, pretend guns on the playground, even Nerf guns. And some of these can look really realistic. You want to say, in games, people pretend to shoot, but that's pretend. In real life, with real guns, people get hurt. It's never a game. And if you're ever worried about a gun being real, or you think you saw one, or you're just afraid of, any guns in our community environment in general, come to me. You never want them to feel afraid to come talk to you about. If a friend said, oh, we have a gun at my house, or, oh, my dad uses guns, you want to encourage your kid to talk to you about that, so that you can figure out when and where you feel comfortable with them being. Ages 10 to 12, when the topic of war or violence comes up, you can start making comparisons, give context. They can handle it. Talk about war abroad, war outside of our country versus violence at home, school shootings, just random acts of violence in your cities, your towns, or even within homes. Maybe they've known someone that has been through this. Hopefully they haven't themselves. And um, you can again use the Socratic method. Ask your kids, why do you think wars start? Why are some kids more at risk than others for violence? Have them really start thinking about what these causal reasons are. And to your point, Ollie, this idea that, no one is more deserving of violence than anyone else or peace than anyone else, but the reality is our circumstances are different, and start exploring that. You can start even with 10 to 12-year olds, start talking about these systemic issues, inequalities that lead to violence. And that's everything from gangs, wealth inequality, poverty, racism, and then, of course, access to the weapons themselves. So you can get into all that. They're ready. With 10 to 12-year olds, encourage expression, art, drawing, journaling, different ways, songs, performing their feelings about fear, about violence. Art's a really good way to express yourself in ways that sometimes words alone cannot. And kind of gives kids some latitude to get those complicated feelings out and try to deal with the issue. So you definitely want to encourage that when it comes to violence. Hey, why don't you paint a picture about that? Hey, why don't you go write a song about it? And then again, talk about the media that they're watching. What are you watching? What does this mean? What does this encourage you to do in the real world? What does it show you not to do? And mostly, how does it make you feel? If you're watching someone get hurt, whether it's a superhero or a supervillain doing it, or, a mob boss character, whether it's animated, whether it's live action, how are you feeling? Do you feel safe? Do you feel encouraged? Do you recognize that this isn't real? You definitely want to have all those conversations with your 10 to 12-year-old. And lastly, our favorite group, the most interesting, most applicable to our friend Ali Khan over here, teenagers, 13 plus. What do you say to the old teenager who already knows everything when war and violence come up? Well, here's where you can get really deep, right? You can start talking about the morality of violence in general. We were talking about, was World War II justified? Is violence ever okay? You can start to get a little bit of philosophical with these kids. You can talk about structural injustice, how it intersects with a person or group's identity, how privilege factors in to violence and who it's perpetrated against. Your kid might say, well, we're safe. Why are we safe? What did we do to deserve it? And you just explain. You can get into why some others are in circumstances where violence is more prevalent or more likely, and it is not, hopefully, where you are, but that it's still possible because we all live in this society together. And what can we do to change that? With teenagers, you want to talk about real wars. It's not theoretical. Talk about historical wars, talk about wars that are going on right now. Talk about refugees. I mean, gosh, that's certainly happening, when people are fleeing violence in their own homelands to come often to America, and unfortunately, at least at this writing,
They were.
aren't always welcomed with open arms, depending on the administration that is in power when this airs. Feel free to talk about these active shooter drills, like, why do we have them? Why are they necessary? I wish we didn't have to have these, but this is the reality. Gun violence in schools is a topic you need to address head on. How, common it is in the country, how common it is in your state, what laws, policies, social programs are designed to make it more or less likely where you live. And talk about the role of bystanders and activism, and how, small acts, while they might not feel like they have a direct effect on, lowering gun violence, even just making a speech or talking to a friend or joining a group against violence, or just, having a conversation about why you think, gun control is important. That matters. All of it matters. Again, drip, 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 right? You want to encourage your kids, your teenagers, to think critically about violence. Kind of what we were talking about. Is it ever used for just means? When is it harmful? When is it not? What can you do, again, to try to promote more peaceful methods? And then, and this is the big one, model your own discomfort with it, your own struggles, your own questions, because I think, again, we know we don't have all the answers. That's literally why we're talking about this. We're asking the big question because we have big questions about the big questions. But the truth is, we don't have the answers. Ollie and I, or even the experts, don't have the answers on how to prevent all gun deaths. And that's okay. Say it. because maybe the kids will come up with something. Maybe they'll save us. But just you want to again always encourage that dialogue is important. You can come to us, ask your questions, tell us your feelings, and make sure that this isn't a conversation that has to wait until some tragedy happens, but that there are at least conversations about how to try to prevent tragedy in the future.
The one thing that I feel like I've come away from doing this is recognizing, certainly in the initial approach of this conversation, of course, like, when you're dealing with, say, Zeke, a 5-year-old, they're going to look at this with massive, I think, just buckets of fear, right? And then something happens between Zeke's age to Heath's age. Right now he's been crushing through 20th century history, which is basically a ton of war. A ton of war stuff. And he's like literally loving it. His history teacher even said, the boys eat this stuff up. There's something in there where they're like just legitimately engrossed. And last year, he did not like history. Now he's like really into it. And there's something in there where as the years go on, and maybe there is, I mean, again, the teacher did bring up the fact that the boys, she had mentioned, to cite out the gender, really are into this kind of subject matter. But at some point where war, which is obviously a mass act of violence, despite whatever logical reasons created or whatever, is something that becomes of interest. And I do think there's something there where violence goes from something scary to something we start to become numb to. And then you start to realize, like, maybe we're just on a path to become less empathetic for some reason, and that could be a variety of things. And I feel like that's something like, you almost kind of get caught up into like, okay, well, who's winning the war? It's like, no one wins. Nobody wins. It was a failure. And then it'll take years, decades, centuries for that pain to ever resolve, if it ever does. If it ever does. So to me, a big thing about this is like the opportunity to like really approach all this stuff, violence and war, with instilling more empathy and knowing that as we get older, or as kids get older, they can go from being very, very scared to being a little numb to it all, you know?
Right. Well, it's time for our toolkit.
Perfect. Damn, here we go. Gotta
Yeah,
get the toolkit.
of course. I mean, this is for, if you just folks who just wanted to fast forward to minute 53 and get bullet points A through H. Crazy I
Mm.
said bullet points in the
That's half the alphabet.
A. I know, right? Is it? Is that in the 13th letter?
Feels like the midpoint.
Okay. Feels like, in fact, F your feelings, right?
Wait, I'm a third of the way in.
Okay, that's fine. Um, here's the toolkit. Here's the toolkit, which is the practical steps for parents to talk to their kids about war and violence. Tool A, ask and listen first. Start by asking your kids, what do you know about what's going on? What have you heard? You don't have to get on a soapbox. You don't have to lecture. You don't have to provide more context without knowing first what do they know? What do they want to know? Give them space for their thoughts and their feelings. Do not rush to explain. That's tool A. Ask and listen first. Tool B. Clarify safety and reality. Use your age appropriate truth. Tell your kids violence happens, but here, these are the things we're doing to keep you safe. You can explain drills, rules, their schools, practices, ways of keeping their community safe if they're relevant. But that's tool B. Make sure that you clarify that these are the safety precautions and this is the reality. Tool C. Name the issues, provide context. Talk about guns, talk about video games, talk about war, talk about shootings. You can say, these are all different, but they all share one thing, which is that someone or many people get hurt. People are unsafe as a result. You want to be able to introduce the idea of privilege. You can say, because of where we live, because of our resources, because of our school, we feel more protected. But not everyone does. And by the way, that doesn't mean we are 100% protected. You need to name the issues directly. You need to give your kids the context. Tool D. Frame questions of justice, empathy, and action. You can ask your kids, what makes someone act violently? Let them understand the root causes. Ask your kids, what can we do instead of acting violently? What are some alternatives to violence? You want to encourage action, real, concrete actions that your kids can take against violence, whether it's writing a letter to an elected official or an organization, starting a fundraiser, volunteering against violence, or even, again, just being kind to a stranger, being kind to a kid who maybe isn't always met with kindness by their peers. Tool E, this is something for the parents where you really have to get hands-on, manage their media exposure. We talked about this. Monitor what your kids are watching, what your kids are playing on the tablets. And that goes for what you're watching when they're present. We talked about news being on. Social media, maybe they're looking at over your shoulder, games you're playing. Anything that they're exposed to that has violent imagery, violent messages, violence, war, guns in general, you should know about. Doesn't mean you have to prohibit it. Obviously, make sure it's age appropriate, but you need to manage their media. Tool F, promote emotional expression. We had talked about encouraging drawing, writing, conversations, songs, performances, dance, whatever is going to help your kids work through their fear, their anger, their confusion. Validate all of the emotions because all of the emotions surrounding violence are valid, and just make sure they have a space to express themselves in more than just talking with you about it. Tool G, reinforce routine and reassurance. You want to maintain your normal activities, keep structure, keep the fun going. You want kids to know that they have a sense of stability, even when world events feel unstable. I'm thinking of the film Life is Beautiful, Roberto Benigni, where he made the Holocaust a game. That's novel, huh? And I think the whole idea, but the idea is, yes, chaos is happening all around us, and joy can happen too. You don't want your kid to be constantly living in fear because, that's not helpful either. You want them to kind of have their head on their shoulders, realize what is a real threat, that violence is real. It's not just a game, but also not make it their be all end all of their everyday existence. That's not fair to them either. And then tool H, talk about how we're lucky that we're safe and what can we do to help those who aren't. So this is tool H, connecting to bigger ideas, connecting to our responsibility. You want to see how you can help others who maybe aren't feeling safe. And this is, again, an opportunity to use to make violence as a topic a teachable moment and bring up other, adjacent topics, justice, equality, responsibility, things like that.
I'll tell you the big thing. The old Life is Beautiful. May have to rewatch that one. Man. Yeah. Yeah. I wonder how that would play out. I might give it a whirl. You know what? I think it's really interesting because we just watched All Quiet on the Western Front, which is anti-war. At least there's that. But I think that Roberto Benigni one. That's my takeaway. Which part of the toolbox was that? Was that G?
What which one? Make sure they have a stable, normal.
Yeah.
Yeah, G. Good
Yeah.
listening.
Yeah. That one stuck with me. Maybe it's because you said make the Holocaust a game.
Yeah,
You're right. Yeah,
probably
watch the
is a
movie in
video
theaters.
game, for some, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Anyways, well, any parting thoughts on our violence and war big questions episode?
I honestly, the big thing for me is just kind of, I feel like I was empathetic or I was apathetic until Sandy Hook. It took me being a dad watching, little kids get killed to be like, whoa, this is not something far away. And I think maybe it doesn't look like it'll happen certainly anytime soon. It seems like it. But maybe this will be the start if we kind of push our kids to be more empathetic to the victims of violence, that we could start to really relook at the sources and find better solutions. Because you really have to say to yourselves, like, if I can get a drone to deliver me Raising Cane's, how can we not have any more school shootings? That's my big takeaway. That's my final thought.
I'll leave it there. Thanks for listening to our Big Questions War and Violence episode.